Welcome to the Creating Safe and Welcoming Environments for Traumatized LGBTQ Youth webinar, presented by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network's Child Sexual Abuse Committee. My name is Jennifer Grady, and I'm with the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress, and will be facilitating today's presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few reminders. If you'd like a copy of the slides for this presentation, they may be downloaded from the Learning Center. Other resources associated with this video will also be included. We'd like to ask that all of you complete the post-presentation evaluation survey. This information will help us tailor future presentations to our audience and provide useful feedback to the presenters. Anyone wishing to receive CE credit for this presentation must complete the post-presentation evaluation survey first, at which time you'll be prompted to complete a CE post-test. Today's presentation will be archived on the Learning Center website. That makes it possible for you to view the presentation at a later time, as well as complete the CE post-test and print your CE certificate at any time. The presenter of today's webinar are Dr. Judy Cohen of Allegheny General Hospital, Al Killen-Harvey of Chadwick Rady's Children's Hospital, Antonia Barba of Jewish Board and Family and Children's Services in New York, and Arturo Zinni of Philadelphia Alliance for Child Trauma Services. I'm pleased to turn over today's presentation to Dr. Cohen. Next slide, please.
Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning youth experience more trauma than their straight peers. Exact data are hard to obtain in this regard for many reasons. Youth who are at different stages of coming out or who feel less safe in answering questions about their sexual orientation, gender identity, or trauma experiences may contribute to underestimating these data. LGBTQ are also not a unitary group. For example, the latest school surveys indicate that transgender youth experience even higher trauma rates than other LGBTQ youth. Some good news suggests that rates of some types of trauma are declining as gay, straight student alliances are improving education, awareness, and safety in schools. However, the numbers remain far too high across the board. Next slide, please.
LGBTQ youth, like other youth, face a variety of traumas. What's important for us is to pay attention to the additional vulnerability that this population faces. For example, issues around sexual abuse. Since this population is highly marginalized, they are often quite vulnerable to others who prey upon that vulnerability. It's important for us to remember that these youth don't see themselves as necessarily fitting in the mainstream. They may be very reluctant to disclose issues of vulnerability and trauma for fear that it may out them prematurely. Physical and emotional abuse are also quite pervasive within this population. Many times youth report that while they were not necessarily overtly physically abused or sexually abused, it is the day-to-day lack of inclusion, of validation for who they are, of affirmation for their being that most challenge them throughout their developmental process. As professionals, we need to pay particular attention to this and try always to create safe environments for these youth to come out to us. We know that bullying has become quite a popular topic for people to focus on throughout the United States. LGBTQ youth are particularly vulnerable to this. Adolescence is a time where individuals are trying to figure out how they fit and where they fit. And LGBTQ youth are often the subjects of others who are trying to feel a sense of power and control over their environment. Again, the dilemma for these youth are the challenge of telling someone else that they have been victimized, that they've been bullied. How do I talk about this without also outing myself? And if I out myself, what are the ramifications for that as well? This population also experiences a tremendous amount of community violence as well. We know that LGBTQ youth have experienced physical abuse. We know that trans youth in particular experience many higher degrees of physical assault and are vulnerable to that on an ongoing basis. One of the areas that only recently has begun really being focused on is domestic violence within the LGBT community, particularly as it relates to adolescents. Domestic violence, as we know, is many times at its heart and at its core is about power and control. Bearing in mind that for these individuals, they oftentimes don't feel a sense of control, we can understand why they may be more vulnerable. One of the dilemmas for youth that may be in a same-sex sexual relationship and experiencing violence from their partner is, again, that dilemma of, in order to tell somebody that this is going on, what does that mean about my ability to be able to disclose that I'm in a relationship with somebody of the same sex or gender? These dilemmas oftentimes keep the victim quiet and allow the perpetrator of the violence to be able to inflict that violence on a much longer basis than may happen in other relationships. There's many biases and discriminations that happen on a day-to-day basis for this population. As healthcare professionals and mental health professionals, it's important for us to be able to provide an opportunity for these individuals to be honest and real and genuine about who they are, while bearing in mind that they continue to live in a world that still does not necessarily see them as part of the mainstream. This can be challenging for us and can be challenging for them as well. Next slide, please.
So here are just a few examples of the potentially fatal impact of bias and discrimination. I was a resident in 1982 when we heard about a new diagnosis that was just introduced, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, better known as AIDS. And during that decade that ensued, we lost thousands of lives unnecessarily, including our friends, in my case, my residency director, primarily young gay men. And through a remarkable work of investigative journalism, this book describes how this occurred through a combination of bias, discrimination, political correctness, and just plain greed. Next slide, please. And this is the author of that remarkable book, Randy Schultz, who was so dedicated to telling the truth and to his job, which was objective journalism, and telling the story of bias and discrimination against his community, that he delayed getting antibody testing himself, which contributed to his own early death. Next slide, please. So move forward in time about 15 years to 1998, and a young student who was attending college the same time that my oldest daughter went to college. This student was going to college in Wyoming. He went to a bar. He met up with some other young guys. And here he is. His name is Matthew Shepard. Next slide, please. But this is the fence where Matthew Shepard was tied up, beaten, and left to die because, unlike many other college students, Matthew was gay. And he was left to die there. Next slide, please. And 15 years later, we're in 2015. 36 states have ratified gay marriage. A transgendered woman has appeared on the cover of Time magazine. Things are much better, right? Not so fast. Just 2 months ago, Leila Alcorn steps in front of a truck and commits suicide with this impassioned cry, a plea for her death to bring attention to the plight of other trans youth who have not been heard, who can't live because they can't live the way they need to. And she says, the only way I can rest in peace is if one day transgender people aren't treated the way I was. Please let my death mean something. And next slide, please. This is her mother's statement on social media about Leila's death, and we can see even in death she does not receive the validation that she and other trans children so desperately need. Next slide, please. For many years, the NCTSN Child Sexual Abuse Committee has had a focus on LGBTQ youth and trauma. Among many other products, we've developed an information sheet, which you see here, for professionals about LGBTQ youth and sexual abuse, which is a type of trauma, as you'll hear in the video, that has a particular impact on LGBTQ youth. And you can see here some of the details that are included in this information sheet, and we really encourage you to take a look at this information sheet, and we hope that it will be useful in your clinical work. Next slide, please. During this current grant cycle, our center, the Allegheny General Hospital Center for Traumatic Stress, decided that we needed to do even more. We dedicated a significant amount of our own grant money to developing a video related to the needs of traumatized LGBTQ youth, and we're so delighted that we were able to collaborate with our community partner here in Pittsburgh, the PERSAD Center, as well as with the Child Sexual Abuse Committee, the National Center, and the professionals who are participating in this webinar, and most particularly importantly, the youth at PERSAD Center to develop this webinar, and also Applebox, a Pittsburgh video production company. And above all, we are so grateful to the youth from PERSAD who provided the direction and inspiration for the video. And Al is going to describe more the process of developing the video. Al.
Thank you, Judy. It was such a privilege for me and for my colleagues to be a part of this process, and we're so excited for all of you to be able to view the video, which you will see shortly. We had the opportunity to meet in Pittsburgh with 5 remarkable LGBTQ youth who bravely, courageously, unselfishly stepped forward and said, yes, I would love to tell you my story so that others can hear this story, because I think my story isn't a unique story in some ways. And that is so true. So we had the opportunity, my colleagues and I, to sit with these youth and to ask them to tell us day to day, what is it like now, 2015, to be LGBTQ in the United States? What have your experiences been, both from a strengths point of view, what are the affirmations you found, and from a challenge point of view? Where are those vulnerabilities? Where are those risk factors for you? I think for me, and I would guess from talking with my colleagues, as well, we went into this with a great deal of excitement and anticipation, but I don't think we fully realized what was about to happen. This video became, for us, more than just a teaching tool. It became really a transformational experience for us being involved with it. Many of us that have worked in the LGBT community for years, I think over time we've talked about these issues so often that we might even secretly believe that what we're talking about is really historical, that really the risk factors for LGBTQ youth obviously have to have changed because society and its viewpoints have changed. These youth have reminded us in some ways that is true, and in many ways, unfortunately, that is not true. That there have not still been the significant changes that we were hoping for, that LGBTQ youth still are at tremendously high risk of many types of traumas and medical and mental health disparities, and that became abundantly clear to us. The opportunity to sit with these youth and listen to their stories, as brave as they are to tell them, to also see the tremendous accomplishments that they've made in their lives despite the fact that they have had to fight through homophobia and heterosexism, was really for us quite an emotional experience. It was an affirmation of the work that we've done up till now, and it was also a real call to us that we can't stop now, that we have so much more to do. These youth are depending upon us, the medical and mental health professionals throughout the United States, to provide those safe spaces for them in order for them to become the kinds of beings that they were meant to be able to fully participate in our society. We're watching more and more as LGBTQ youth come into their adulthood with less of the discrimination and barriers that they had before. What a rich fabric of our society that they can become. And these youth were another reminder of that. Each and every one of them doing creative and fascinating sort of work in their world. And we think to ourselves, what more could they do if they didn't have to be held back at times by other people's biases and prejudices? So this video has really been such an amazing experience for all of us. And we're so proud of being a part of it, and we're so pleased that you're going to get a chance to actually be able to meet, through video, these 5 amazing young folks. And with that, I'm going to ask for the next slide, and we're going to turn it over and let you actually view this video and meet these remarkable young people.
LGBT youth are taught, from a young age that they are less valued.
You're constantly aware of your safety.
I had no idea that I should have went out and sought help because all I knew was what my family members were telling me or putting in my mind.
Sexual assault, physical assault, verbal assault are not uncommon.
We're used to protecting ourselves, and we kind of build up our own walls.
And until we feel safe, those walls will not come down.
The safety of our children is one of society's most important obligations. The evidence is clear that traumatized children are significantly more at risk for developing behavioral, psychological, physical health, learning, and relationship problems as adults, unless their trauma is addressed early and effectively. But trauma comes in many forms: domestic and community violence, bullying, sexual, physical, and emotional abuse, just to name a few. This presentation looks at the trauma experiences of children that many of us overlook or never truly consider. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning youth, LGBTQ youth, experience high rates of trauma, often related to their sexual orientation or gender identity. 74% of LGBTQ youth experience verbal harassment related to their sexual orientation. LGBTQ youth are twice as likely as their straight peers to be physically assaulted at school. 56% of LGBTQ students do not feel safe at school.
I'm a victim of multiple sexual assaults. My first sexual assault experience was by a doctor when I was 5. So I need to have a patient advocate in the room with me. I need to have a friend in there. And so explaining all of that and having space to do that and not having pushback, because sometimes medical providers will say, this is a private thing, this is your session. But really great medical providers are able to meet all of those needs, and then I have a good experience. And if they don't meet those needs, then in fact I'm reliving trauma.
Discrimination has impacted my life tremendously, especially not just being an African American, but being a gay African American, being in a black family. Discrimination has been internalized, personalized so much. And I was very close with my father's side, and my grandmother put me in church, and that was a big deal to me. And of course, church and homosexuals don't have very good rapport with each other. And I was put into Exodus Ministries, which is a gay conversion ministry, at a very young age. And it was huge. It was always telling me all day, every day, that you are not who you are. You're supposed to be someone different. The way you're feeling is wrong. I was definitely a victim of that.
I think that LGBT youth experience struggles after trauma, again, in different ways from their peers. In high school, that was pretty much the norm, and probably for a lot of reasons is people are not disclosing.
Over the past 20 years, more adolescents, young adults, and even children have been coming out about their sexual and gender orientation or identity. There has never been a better time to come out, as cultural changes, greater public awareness, and information accessible on the internet have all provided increased societal support. Kids are coming out earlier, embracing and asserting their sexual and gender identity. For many LGBTQ youth, this is a positive and exciting time in their lives. Yet for many, the result of coming out at a younger age is greater vulnerability to experiencing trauma.
Anytime you have an individual who is part of a marginalized community, the risk factors certainly escalate, and that's clearly true for LGBTQ youth.
While some youth are celebrated and embraced, many youth experience rejection by their parents, family, school, friends, and community.
I think LGBT youth experience negative things about their identity on a daily basis growing up.
And rejection becomes a part of their weekly ritual, depending on who they choose to let in and who they choose not to.
There have been times in my life where I have felt the need to conceal that part of my identity, whether for work or because I did not feel that it was otherwise a safe situation.
This rejection significantly affects both the emotional and physical health of the youth. Studies indicate LGBTQ youth who reported high levels of family rejection were 8 times more likely to report having attempted suicide. They are 6 times more likely to report high levels of depression. As a result of these trauma experiences, many LGBTQ youth find themselves isolated and alone, requiring assistance from community, mental health, and other agencies.
So when kids got kicked out of their homes, we had to take them into our homes. And we're students. We're going to college. We're trying to figure stuff out, and we have no idea what we're doing.
Sexual abuse for LGBTQ youth can be much more complicated than it can be for majority youth, because the fundamental element of being sexually violated calls into question for everybody a sense of, was there something about who I am as a sexual being that somehow made me more vulnerable to being preyed upon? And that is a question that kids that are struggling with sexual orientation are dealing with anyway, regardless of the trauma.
Traditionally, the mental health and social service providers in our country have not done a very great job of understanding and protecting the needs of LGBTQ youth. And so I can imagine for a youth who's experienced trauma, even figuring out if they should seek treatment or support is kind of an added layer or a barrier that they might experience. And if they decide to seek support, if they want to report, if they want to seek treatment, they're going to have maybe a difficult decision-making process about where to go. Where are they going to be safe?
The way that professionals respond to traumatized LGBTQ youth makes a real and lasting impact on the lives of these youth at perhaps the most critical juncture of their lives. If youth encounter bias when seeking help, they may be re-traumatized and not seek help in the future. Without strategies for including and welcoming traumatized LGBTQ youth, therapists and agencies may inadvertently re-traumatize these youth. These problems go unrecognized, the trauma untreated, and the cycle continues.
I think more youth who need help are not accessing help because they don't feel like that environment, or they don't anticipate that the environment will be welcoming. If they go there and they have an experience that makes them uncomfortable, or where they feel like they don't quite belong, it gives the message that this isn't for me, or you may not really know how to help me.
I think it's important for providers to know what assumptions they might be making around their clients. Are you asking girls if they have boyfriends? Are you asking boys about sports teams? Are you using preferred pronouns for trans youth?
Organizations need to look at their settings, and look at it from the eyes of an LGBTQ youth walking in. If I walked in the setting, do I see me there? Do I feel like this is a place for me, or does it look nothing like me? Because that sends a really strong message.
A safe place is a space where youth are not only safe from harm, but where they're also nurtured, empowered, and I think where they feel free to be themselves and not afraid of being themselves.
We're a product of the world that we live in, and we've been acculturated a certain way. And I think that there are a lot of ways that unintentionally we as therapists, as helpers, may be sending messages that are actually are barriers that can be harmful to our traumatized clients. And sometimes that takes the form of the language that we're using.
I think language in therapy can always be a bridge and an obstacle. And it has a lot to do with the therapist's skill to make sure that we're using language, and we are using language that the youth refers to can identify with, and language that it's empowering to their needs.
If you genuinely want to attract LGBTQ clients, if you want to be able to provide adequate services, create visibility. Don't be ashamed that you're targeting, your recruitment efforts for this population. Say, we are a safe space.
Be vocal that you are a supporter, and then back up that claim. So have a rainbow flag in the office, and tell me about how you went down to Pride even though you're an ally. Or explain to me how you are somewhat familiar with this because you have treated other patients like me. Because word gets around the community if you just have the flag and you know nothing, or if you are completely unwelcoming, or if you are very welcoming and very accommodating.
I think when working with LGBTQ youth, we need to realize that, not unlike all youth, they have an amazing radar. They are scanning for lots of things. They are looking at the environment in which we are interacting with them and looking at and picking up on nuances that maybe sometimes we sort of take for granted. Context becomes everything for adolescents.
Be mindful that many traumatized youth are LGBTQ. Don't make assumptions about sexual orientation or gender identity when meeting new clients.
We've been able to create our own safe spaces, and I think when people respond, just in general practice with real interest, that's where change is made.
Everybody can be a potential bridge and ally for these youth. You don't need tons of education. You don't need tons of anecdotal and personal experience around it. What you need is an open heart and an open mind and a willingness to be that bridge.
Bias can come in many forms and situations. It can go unnoticed by professionals with years of experience.
Look deep and hard at your own bias. We all have them, and it's hard for professionals to look at bias because they went into this work loving and wanting to help people, and so you don't want to think, well, I have these biases, but we all do.
So if an LGBTQ youth, the traumatized LGBTQ youth, seeks services and an agency or organization that is not supportive or does not create that safe space, I think we would be perpetuating what they went through outside our office space.
They may be more reluctant to access social and health services. They may have a larger fear of loss of friends, disclosing in a different environment because trauma is then overlaid with sexual identity and any kind of disclosure issues that may be associated with that disclosure.
Even the most subtle forms of insensitivity can re-trigger chronic emotional trauma.
We're different. We're so much different, and a lot of the different negative things that happen in our lives that are similar to someone from the general population sometimes just have a bigger effect on us because we see the world much more through sensitive eyes. And we've been forced to do that our whole life because we've always been trying to figure out where we fit in.
Bias directed toward LGBTQ youth occurs every day in our care centers, and it represents a growing, ongoing, and unanswered problem.
It's not just about creating this cosmetic effect that makes it look like I'm a safe organization. Are we really? Have we individually and collectively as an agency, as an organization, looked at how we feel about this? What are our own biases? What are our own histories around sexual orientation and gender identity? What are our own judgments that we bring into that? And have we really talked about that? Have we created a space for our professional staff to talk about that first? If that kind of conversation and exploration hasn't already been done, it doesn't matter how many of those other sort of safe cues you've created in your environment, those youth are going to pick up on that right away. And actually, in many ways, feel kind of like they've been led astray. So to create a safe space is not just about the external, it's also about the internal process of the individual and the organization, and both need to be there.
Our challenge is to become aware of and eliminate this bias. Examples of ignorance and bias include being completely unaware that an LGBTQ youth is sitting across from you because you didn't ask or simply assumed.
One of the ways that they are not inclusive is simply they're blind to the existence of LGBTQ youth. They don't see them, and they think that the youth are straight, or the youth are gender congruent, and so they simply don't see it. Some of the ways that the not inclusiveness shows up is in not asking. So when we just assume what we know about somebody and we don't really ask, then they're not identified to us. So that's one way. Even before they get in the door, sometimes we're not inclusive because we're not reaching out to those particular communities or those kids where they are or where they congregate, and so they're not invited to come to care.
Bias includes giving a message that you hope the LGBTQ youth is mistaken about their identity. It could be suggesting that their trauma was caused by their LGBTQ identity, or their identity was caused by their trauma.
I think a lot of LGBTQ youth might be struggling with their identity, but a lot aren't. And it's important to know that you might have a gay client in front of you or a trans client who's totally fine with their identity, and it's not has nothing to do with the trauma they experienced. So again, I think it's important to kind of let the youth provide those answers.
Assuming that everybody else's experience is the same, you are opening yourself up for a whole world of trouble.
Because of bias and discrimination, LGBTQ youth are at a higher risk for mental and other health disparities.
I think it's really important for LGBT youth to be out of the closet to their doctor or to their counselor, because there's different health disparities that LGBT youth face that are unique and maybe in more of a crisis than heterosexual youth. And for the doctor to understand their patient, they can already make the connection what that person might be facing as far as health disparities or mental health.
It's important for them to know what sexual risk behaviors are, what behaviors are risky. I think it's also important for them to know how to protect themselves from sexually transmitted infections, how to get tested for HIV or for other infections. Most communities have free HIV testing available. And I think it's important for providers to be able to give that information to youth because they might not be able to get that elsewhere or even know that that's important information for them to know.
By turning to emerging, evidence-based research and proven best practices, youth-serving professionals can significantly improve their services and the quality of care to our country's traumatized LGBTQ youth.
If we can make really good corrections in schools, in medical services, in counseling services, in faith communities, when all of those systems become more competent and less biased, then kids will go through their development and the world in the way that every other kid does. So it will even the playing field. That's my hope.
I have lots of respect for professionals who are willing to leave their comfort zone and become more informed and aware of the needs of LGBTQ youth and how to support them and how to provide effective evidence-based treatment. And I will tell them that to please join us in helping these youth because there's not enough of us. So we need more professionals.
How can you improve the quality of your care related to serving LGBTQ youth? The place to start is with yourself. By examining your own beliefs about the LGBTQ community, you can honestly assess what type of support, resources, and training you might need to improve your services and work environment. Be mindful that most LGBTQ youth have experienced trauma, such as bullying, sexual or physical abuse, or other forms of trauma. As a professional, it is important to ensure that you are safe and welcoming for LGBTQ youth.
A safe place is a place where a youth can walk in and feel comfortable being all aspects of themselves, whether that's with regard to their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their gender expression, their race, their ethnicity, their culture, their religion. All parts of themselves are comfortable and welcome.
In talking about creating a safe space, I think it's also important for us to look at what happens if that safety is not there. We understand, those of us that work in the trauma field, that safety is a fundamental component in trauma resolution. Our youth, our adults, anyone that's experienced trauma is never going to be able to fully resolve that unless and until they feel like they're in a safe space. That's just a basic 101. That's it.
Build good relationships with local resources, because your consumers are going to need them. So you need to know who are your friendly practitioners, your friendly medical people, your friendly schools, your friendly churches, all of the places, so that wherever you refer LGBTQ youth to, you're not sending them somewhere where they'll have a bad experience, but you're sending them somewhere where they will be welcomed.
It's also good to know about websites and organizations, online resources that might be important for LGBTQ youth to have access to. So maybe printing out some of these materials.
Next, take a good, close look at your working environment. Is your office a safe and welcoming place for LGBTQ youth? You can quickly and easily create a more inclusive environment using signage. Make certain you have literature meant for LGBTQ individuals openly displayed, along with a non-discriminatory policy.
I look for policy. I look for non-discrimination policies. I look to see that gender identity and sexual orientation are included in those things. I look for materials around waiting rooms that indicate that there is an idea that LGBT people exist in this environment.
Like small things such as having an LGBTQ brochure or the rainbow flag in the waiting area in your office, having questions in your assessment process that target specifically questions about LGBTQ youth that are asked in a very safe, non-judgmental way.
So if I go to you seeking medical care and I tell you that in order to create a safe space for me, these certain things need to be done, I need you to follow through and I need you to listen. I need you to respect my pronouns. I need you to respect what my name is. I need you to respect any kind of extra needs that I have. If I tell you that I need something, listen and follow through on it.
It's so important for organizations to really make sure to do some self-reflection and to do some work to ensure that they themselves as individual providers and also that the program that they and the institutions that they work for are LGBTQ affirming and really understanding of what those needs are.
To kids and professionals, if you're watching this video, what I would say to you is that you've already taken a really great step already, and I would just encourage anyone watching to continue on that path, to continue to be enlightened, and continue to pursue knowledge so that you can help all types of people.
For more information about guidelines and policies for counseling LGBTQ youth and trauma, please visit the following websites.
Now that you've had this opportunity to watch this amazing video, we're guessing that you have all kinds of ideas and questions that you want to start moving forward with. And how can you possibly take some of these great ideas and move them forward into potential changes in your practice, looking at how your organization works with LGBTQ youth, how you can expand upon where this video ends. Arturo and Antonia are now going to take us through some answers to those questions and how you might use this video in your practice and with others in and outside of your organization.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I just wanted to start by first saying and just echoing some earlier thoughts about what a truly amazing experience it was to be a part of this project and how inspired and privileged we all felt to be able to collaborate with these youth. We talked a lot about how the stories and experience of others, just hearing and sharing in them, can be such a transformative experience and such a valuable and rich learning opportunity. And so with this video, our intent was really to create a useful resource that would not only inform people and provide some information, but also really prompt watchers to reflect on their own practice and think about how they could change their practice, what is something new that they could implement. And so to that end, we created a video resource guide. And again, our hope is that people will not only watch this video and think a lot about it, but follow that with some discussion and collaborative work with their colleagues. So we created this video resource guide with some kind of just general discussion questions that paired with the video to really help people think about how can I initiate this conversation with my colleagues? How can I start to, like Jennifer said, reflect on my work and think about what I'd like to do, what I'd like to implement or change. And so we have a couple of the discussion questions from that resource guide and thought we would just kind of start to talk through some of those with all of you today. And so one of the first questions, and this was referenced a bit in the video as well, was about how well what does your current assessment process look like? What do the intake forms look like? And how do those meet or not meet the needs of LGBT youth? So really taking some time to take a look at what the intake forms are. I talk a lot with my colleagues about how assessment forms are even implemented. Are these something that are being done over the phone? Are they being done face-to-face? Is this done verbally? And really, are we in any stage of the process, are we asking all of the questions that are on the intake? Does the intake form include questions about sexual orientation, around gender identity, gender presentation? Are we making any assumptions about the person that's sitting in front of us or the person that's on the phone with us? And are we really giving them the opportunity in a safe way to express their identity to us? Arturo, I don't know if you have anything that you'd like to add to that.
Yes. Thank you, Antonia. I think, first I completely agree with everything that you just said and how privileged I felt being part of the video process and now of this webinar. And I think, our assessment and forms that we have in our agencies are so important, and as you mentioned, the questions that we include, because we know how first impressions can be, long-lasting and how powerful they can be. So if from the beginning we don't create a safe and welcoming environment, kids or youth might, feel scared, not feel safe, or just, they won't come back because their needs are not being met.
Absolutely. We talk a lot about, I think it's important to think about that first impression that we're making. And like you said, if those questions are included, that's sending a message that this is something that I'm open to hearing. This is something that we are thinking about, that we are valuing as a part of your identity. And if those questions aren't present, what is that saying? Are these questions that are being asked of every new person who walks in the doors, or are we being selective in how we ask those questions? And I also think just, considering how comfortable and familiar am I with the language. In the video we talk a bit about language and the fact that is always evolving. It's kind of impossible to keep on top of all of the latest terms. But also just kind of being open to learning more terms, questioning things when you don't understand, and also I think giving the youth the opportunity to self-identify, to use their language, and again to ask those questions when we're not sure. And just in general, questions about thinking about how, looking at both our current, I think as a provider, what my individual practice is like, how I'm presenting, when I'm working with clients and families, and also my organization as a whole. Thinking about some of the elements that were discussed in the video around signs, symbols, the types of things that people are looking for when they first walk into the doors. As Arturo just said, that first impression is so important. And so really taking some time to consider, are there any signs or symbols that are present currently in the reception area, in my office, in the shared common spaces, that are sending a clear signal that this is a safe place?
And how important it is what you just said, and that the safety and welcoming environment needs to come not only from that particular clinician that's working with this adolescent, but also from the agency staff as a whole. Everybody from your supervisor, front desk staff, security staff at the agency. So everybody who gets in touch or has contact with that adolescent, needs to be welcoming for the youth to feel that she is.
Absolutely. I think things like non-discrimination policies, any guidelines that the agency or organization may have around LGBTQ identity, it's really important that, as Arturo said, not just the clinicians know this, are aware of this, and have had training in this, but really at every level of the organization there is an awareness of these policies. And if they're posted in public places where a client who's walking in the door for the first time can really see that and understand that that's a value that this agency or this organization holds, it's such an important sign. Some of the other things that were mentioned in the video, such as just rainbow flags, symbols. I like to think about the different artwork and photographs that are in reception areas. Are there only certain types of people reflected, or is there a broad range of diversity? These are all things that people are going to be looking for when they walk in to see if this is truly a safe and welcoming place for them to be. Another piece that was referenced in the video was around restrooms, having not just male or female, but gender-neutral bathrooms that are available for anyone to use without having to necessarily identify their gender, can be a huge sign of safety for folks who are walking in the first time. So again, we just want to get folks thinking about, if you are sharing this with other colleagues, if you're watching this together, to talk about what you are currently doing, both individually and organizationally. Do you have any of these signs and symbols that represent safety? And if not, or if you feel like there are more necessary, where can you start to add these? Where can you create some change?
And I think also, Antonia, going back to what you mentioned and the importance of, people being able to reflect on their own, beliefs and attitudes towards LGBTQ youth, which was also mentioned in the video. We do want to create an open environment for, it might be clinicians that we're supervising or non-clinical staff to share how they feel about LGBTQ youth. So we're not saying you must be 100% ally, you must be, you must get this. No, this is an opportunity to maybe tell us why you're not comfortable working with this youth, right?
Absolutely. Most definitely. I think a lot of times the policies or the guidelines may exist, but then there's maybe not adequate room to really talk about some of the challenges that may come up either from individual perspectives and beliefs or from an organizational standpoint. And I think that a critical part of that, of creating safety, is really also creating that safety for each other, for us as providers, to be able to talk about those challenges that may come up and how best to manage them and address them moving forward. Another discussion question, and this is something that I think is of critical importance and huge concern in working with youth, is around managing confidentiality. There were some earlier mentioned kind of ramifications of outing, And so I think a huge concern for LGBTQ youth who are seeking services is whether or not they are out. And if they are sharing information about their trauma, is this going to result in, is this information that's going to be kept confidential, or is this going to be shared with others, and in what context? I think it's really important to consider all of the different individuals who may be interacting with this youth, whether it's caregivers, whether there are other members of your treatment team, collateral care providers who are involved. And I think we always need to consider, when working with youth, who are they out to? Is it just with you? Are there a few select individuals that they are out to? Are they out in general to most people in their life? And we need to, that's an important factor in how we are documenting, how we are sharing information. Are they knowledgeable? Are they aware of who else this information may need to be shared with? Are we checking in with them about that? And are they comfortable having that information shared?
I think, as you said, this is confidentiality. It's such a huge topic, and one that we all need to be aware of and know how important it is to respect the youth confidentiality regarding their own outing process. And we as clinicians might be really excited that maybe we were the first person that they came out to, or one, as you said, Antonia, one of a few selected people, and we might think that it's really important for them to share with their caregivers, right? But they're not ready, or they might be concerned about their own safety. So how important is to respect this confidentiality about the outing process and really go at our youth or clients' pace.
And I think that, thinking about specific case examples, if you are going to pull this topic into a discussion, thinking about what are some case examples where it's uncertain or unclear how much information should be shared or what needs to be shared specifically. I'm thinking about a specific situation I had working with a youth in residential care who was experiencing some suicidal ideation. And a factor of that, there were a number of factors. They had a trauma history and a lack of supports and some isolation. And one facet of their personality or their identity was that they were questioning their sexual orientation. So I had a sense that this was coming into play, but more in the sense of it was just one other kind of stressful thing that this child was considering. But I did have a concern about the risk of suicidality. They had expressed some suicidal ideation, and I knew that I needed to share this with other members of the treatment team in order to keep this youth safe. And so I really had to think about what specific information needs to be shared. Is the fact that this youth who is questioning their sexual orientation and but not out yet, I felt a tremendous burden and responsibility to really protect that aspect of their identity while also communicating the heightened risk. And so was able to make a determination that I could share the information about their suicidal ideation, and we could put a safety plan in place, but that at that point it was not necessary. In order to ensure this child's safety, I did not need to disclose that they were questioning their sexual orientation. And I think these are the types of issues that could come up, and it's really important to consider in advance how you might handle them and talk about that as a team and along with your colleagues or in supervision before you're kind of finding yourself in that moment having to make that decision.
And thank you, Antonia, for sharing, that your own clinical example to everybody, because I think it's such a beautiful example of we're working we're not talking about LGBTQ youth and the issues that they go through because of their sexual orientation, but also traumatized LGBTQ youth. So I really appreciate how you put safety first and you develop a safety plan with the youth, and also because the concerns that you had, you knew it was not the right time to share their sexual orientation with a caregiver or with somebody else.
Absolutely. And exactly. Those are the types of situations that could come up, but I think it's just so important to think about what's of critical necessity when sharing that information, and really making sure that when we do disclose that we're informed informing the child that we are talking with them about why, and that it's done with a real legitimate purpose and not in any type of kind of over-eager way. Absolutely. Can we go to the next slide? So another kind of area that we wanted to get people thinking about was really after viewing this video, based on what you may have learned, what changes would you like to make in your practice or in your department? So really getting folks to start thinking about what might the next steps be. And again, we really wanted people to, our hope is that people will not only become better informed through watching this, but also really start to think about what are some changes that they can implement in their work.
I think this is another, such an important point, because we're talking again about our ability to reflect on what we're doing, and I think it requires for us to be open-minded, because we might be used to doing things a certain way, and if they're working, it's great, right? But sometimes we might realize that they're not working that well for a certain population, such as LGBTQ youth. So I know it takes, it means hard work sometimes, right? But how important it is to sit, hopefully as a group, the team that works with these youth, and really be, able to say, okay, maybe we need to change. There are 5 things that are working really, really well for us, but there's this one thing that we need to change. As Antonia, as you mentioned, and it was mentioned in the video before, maybe, there are no LGBTQ affirming signs. There's no rainbow flag, there's no brochures or flyers that are affirming or validating of LGBTQ youth. So maybe that's the one change that we need to do.
Exactly, and I think that these can be some of these can be simple and concrete. I often like to think about what's something that I can change right away. What is something that I could maybe implement in the next couple of days or weeks? And then thinking about what are some broader changes. And this is often where some of the challenges of implementing an organizational change, we all know that can be a very intense and time-consuming process, that there's a lot of approval that needs to be sought, but I think it's still, it's important to not let that discourage us, but really think about where would we like to see our organization in a year's time. What are some things that I learned about through watching this video that I realized that we are lacking or we could do better, where we're not quite reaching everybody. Things that were talked about, such as outreach to the LGBTQ community, not making assumptions that everyone who walks in the door is heterosexual or cisgender, thinking about what we're really doing to engage this population.
Yeah, and to piggyback on what you just said, Antonia, I remember about assuming that everyone is heterosexual. I remember I was working with a very talented therapist that I was supervising, and she was doing the assessment for youth. They were between 14 and 18 that were involved in the juvenile justice, and they were all boys, right? So we were talking about the assessment process, and she will ask, when we come to the sexuality piece, do you have a girlfriend? To everybody, right? And I reflected on that, and I said that wouldn't leave room for, a gay or bisexual or transgender youth to express their own orientation or gender identity. And she thought about it, and she said, wow, I never thought about this, because I assumed these tough kids, that are involved in the juvenile justice, that got in trouble, that they're all straight. And she was really, she welcomed my suggestion, and she actually changed the way she asked that question. So I thought of that as a very, also a concrete example, something that you can change right away.
That's such a great example, and I especially love the way that you engaged her in a very, open-minded and non-judgmental way. Because I think a lot of times these types, when we are putting these little things into practice that become a part of our routine or that are based on assumption, they're often not done. We all, I hope, come to this work with really good intent, and so sometimes we may say or do something that just is kind of taken for granted, and it's just we're on autopilot and kind of taking a step back and reflecting on what we're doing and how that may unintentionally be communicating some type of bias. And you just did that in a really beautiful way.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I think just as that's a great example of just little changes that we can make in our practice. Using more gender-inclusive language, being more open-ended, and asking instead, are you in a relationship? Are you seeing anyone? Are you interested in anyone? Communicates a completely different thing to that youth that you're working with. And I think that it's also important to move down to the second question in thinking about, okay, now we have a great list. You're sitting with your colleagues and you're talking about this video and you're feeling very energized. And you have a list of things that you can start doing and maybe some long-term goals that you'd like to work toward. I think it's important when you're wanting to put that into practice to start to think about, do I anticipate any challenges or barriers? What could potentially get in the way of me enacting these changes? And then to develop some strategies to address them, to overcome them.
Yes, I think you just hit such an important point about that we know we do very complex work and challenges and barriers will come up. So, right, we better be ready for them and as you said, developing plans on how we will overcome these barriers.
And I think this is where we can kind of pull in a little bit of thought and discussion around intersectionality of race, ethnicity, religious, cultural values, all of these types of things, these different aspects that make up both our individual identities and the identities and cultures of the organizations that we're working within. And that sometimes these just, again, by virtue of tradition and routine and kind of, just our general practice, that there may be things that are happening from an organizational level that feel like they are barriers. And sometimes these feel like they're very difficult to overcome. I can imagine that trying to implement these changes and do this work often in a religious organization where there really isn't any, it doesn't feel like there's any space to talk about LGBTQ identity or even kind of a lack of, or just being uncertain about what type of language to use. Is it acceptable to talk about this? I'm thinking of some work that I've done within some of the programs that work with Orthodox Jewish individuals that are staffed by Orthodox Jewish folks and also serve the Orthodox Jewish population, where we have done such tremendous work to really engage this community and to get people into treatment who need it, but where there may have been stigma around mental health services. And we've made such wonderful inroads and developed these relationships. And what is emerging through this work, where people are talking about all different types of stigmatized things around alcohol and substance abuse, around trauma, domestic violence, sexual abuse, where there really wasn't space to talk about any of those things. There are now discussions happening in treatment as a result. And something that is emerging also is around LGBTQ identity and questions that people are having, both clients and staff, around what is it acceptable or okay to talk about within the religious context. I can feel this need within the community to be able to talk about this. It's an important and critical issue, but I'm not even sure what the parameters are. I'm not sure who to go to. I'm not sure what type of language to use or how maybe too far to go. And so some of that work is just kind of creating safety, both for the clients and the staff, just raising awareness that this is a need, and then where do we go next?
I think, Anthony, you just brought up, and I so much appreciate that you are making it possible for everybody to talk about it, because I think these are very sensitive issues that we sometimes avoid talking about, how religion and culture might affect our work with LGBTQ youth. And as a Latino myself, who has worked with Latino communities for over a decade now, I know that it happened to me more than once as a clinician or as a supervisor, for example, working with LGBTQ youth, with really loving and caring parents that also had a very strong faith, right? Their faith was sometimes the most important thing in their lives, and for their own religion, anything that had to do with LGBTQ youth or LGBT, in general, was a sin, right? Mm-hmm. So you have, this family in your room that, these caregivers that are really loving of their own child, but at the same time they cannot accept or validate, their sexual orientation or gender identity. So how complex that work is, right? Because of course you're going to be respectful of their parents' beliefs, and at the same time you're supporting, your youth, the youth that you're working with. So there's not, I don't think there's one answer about how to work with that family, but really be able to address that in the room. For example, I've asked the parents, so what about your son being gay is a sin? Tell me more about it. Why do you feel it is? And you might never come to an agreement, but maybe they might end up respecting the child's sexual orientation, even if they don't completely agree with it.
I think it's a really important issue that we're starting to talk about now, all of these shades of not one extreme or the other. And when we're talking as mental health professionals, of course, we also have to consider the developmental issues, because more and more we're seeing children at increasing younger ages exploring their gender identity and sexual orientation, and that brings a lot of challenges to very well-meaning and accepting parents. But when you have a 5 or 6-year-old talking about their gender identity, parents are ask a lot of very challenging and difficult and soul-searching questions about what is the right thing to do. And it's not a simple, straightforward answer. Either psychologically or physically, what are the answers? At what age is it right to start, transitioning? So, these are really difficult and not straightforward decisions.
I want to jump on that, Judy. I think you raise a great point. And sometimes the challenge becomes, and the frustration becomes, some of our own countertransference as mental health professionals. It's all well and good to say, that our goal is for all of these youth to be entering into this stage of their development in an open and affirming and welcoming family. That's very simple to say. But when it's your family, when it's your child, even if your philosophical or political beliefs may have been in a more accepting way, it's a whole different ballgame. Parents, family, siblings have their own coming out process to go through as well. And sometimes I find that clinicians try to rush the process and don't respect that it took this child a long time to begin to let us know what was going on for them. And then we expect a parent to be immediately at that same stage of identity development as the child. And we get frustrated or angry with those parents because they can't be there. They have their own confusion around all of this. They have their own community of friends and family whom they ultimately may choose to come out to, that they have a gay or a lesbian or bisexual or transgender child, and that has a complex process to it as well. So I really encourage mental health professionals to be aware of the multiple levels of the coming out process, particularly within a family systems dynamic.
And Al, Antonia and Arturo were talking earlier around confidentiality and the coming out process, and just making sure that the client's gender identity and sexual orientation are maintained within the confines of that relationship. Do you have anything else to add to that? Specifically on what you were just talking about, the multiple layers of the coming out process?
I think they did a great job of addressing the confidentiality piece. What I would add to that conversation is I know that I am bound sometimes, for example, in working with transgender kids, I am bound sometimes by having to refer to them in the sexual assignment that they were born into, because currently that is still their legal status. I think it's important when working with transgender youth that we talk to them about where our restrictions are, what we have to do, how we might have to refer to them, for example, in a report, in a court testimony, in other kind of contexts. I often say to my transgender folks, for example, a male to female transgender client, I know that you're female. You and I both know that, and that is always, I will always respect that here. Periodically, I may have to use your male name. Periodically, I may have to use the male pronoun because I'm bound by that in particular legal or organizational sort of forms or protocols that I'm following, but I want you to understand that I know who you truly are. Those kinds of conversations can be so incredibly affirming. That is not news to transgender youth. They understand that. They see it all the time. And I think we're sometimes afraid to acknowledge that, or we think that they don't know that we're caught in that bind. And that's another way to kind of help create that sort of safe space and affirming space for them.
I just wanted to add to that we as mental health professionals need to be upfront with kids, LGBTQ kids or otherwise, about confidentiality issues and the limitations of that in terms of the age at which they have full confidentiality and the age at which they don't. And some parents have access to their mental health records at a certain, in younger children. And so what we put in the charts we have to be very careful about. And parents that sometimes have gotten access to their younger children's mental health records by, legal means or, behind our backs in one way or the other. So we need to be very aware of that, be open with kids that we're seeing about what's going into their records, what we say, what their parents have access to, and so forth, so that there aren't any unpleasant surprises in that regard.
And I think just to piggyback on that, I love those messages around transparency, and I think that becomes a very, very useful work that we're doing with these youth and ultimately with their families and other providers. And just having conversations, I found often that kids know more about that than I do and have information to share with me, are very savvy and aware, and that becomes a part of the treatment and talking about safety, risk, and confidentiality.
I was thinking as the three of you were talking how much, I agree with everything that you were saying and how important it is to the developmental process and on one side, and on the other side also this honesty, being real and genuine and transparent with the youth and the kids from the beginning. I think that's kind of, in a way, defines what we mean by, creating a safe and welcoming environment. And something that Al mentioned earlier, the importance of this validation that youth desperately need, right? That we're giving them that space in our office where we're really validating them.
Appreciate that. And I would push this a bit further as well. One of the things that I often hear from clinicians when I'm training on LGBTQ youth issues is that there is an added degree of hesitancy, so of fear that I'm going to say the wrong thing, that I'm going to use the wrong terminology, that I'm going to, further add to this sense of isolation or marginalization that the client experiences every single day because I may not be fully comfortable with the language or with the culture. And my response back is, take that risk. Go for it. There is very little, there are some, but there is very, very few things that we can say, well-meaning and well-intentioned, that these youth haven't already heard. And if we make a mistake, then we welcome that into the conversation. Let me know if sometimes my terminology feels a little stiff or stilted, if I'm still learning about this. I want you to help me understand your world as I help you prepare to be even stronger and have a stronger sense of who you are. That kind of dialogue as well, I find, can be incredibly bonding and create that environment. So don't be afraid to show your own vulnerability around that and learn from the client as well.
And Al, there's an incredible parallel between that and how we deal with all traumatized youth. That, we're tiptoeing around so much trying not to, quote, re-traumatize these kids, that what we're doing is really modeling avoidance. You're too fragile for me to talk about this. And it ends up leaving these kids feeling even more isolated, even more stigmatized, when, in fact, if we can show that, you're not so odd, you're not so strange, you're not so different, that we can't talk about this, that we can't accept you and make you feel safe. Instead, if the message is, there's nothing that I can't accept, that I can't talk about here, whether it's your trauma issues, your LGBTQ identity, everything is safe here, everything's on the table here, let's talk about it, because everything about you I can hear, I can accept, I can welcome. That's really what's important. That's what they need to hear. You don't have to be perfect at it. You just have to have, as you said in the video, an open heart, an open mind, the desire to help and learn about it. That's the most important thing.
I want to kind of tangentially related to that, something that I didn't mention in the introduction to the video, and I would love to further the conversation with my colleagues here right now, is sort of the parallel process for us as professionals, particularly for professionals who've been working in this particular arena for a while. We have our own sense at times of isolation, of frustration, of marginalization, even with our own organizations. Many times, if we aren't pushing this particular item to the forefront in our organization, then no one else does, and it doesn't get mentioned. That gets tiring after a while. It's a little difficult when you feel like the burden in the organization for whether or not LGBTQ youth are fully integrated into our system rests upon me as the sole ally around this. And part of what I think we enjoyed about meeting with the youth is it gave us a little bit more fuel to keep operating. But I would love to hear from the rest of you as well as what keeps you hanging in there. We all work for large organizations. We all look for organizations that we've had to push, and to their credit, many of them have responded. But what keeps us going and doing this work?
I think one of the things, as you were talking, I was thinking about how I've grown in the course of, I guess, the 10 years or so that I've been doing this work, and how I very much felt isolated at the onset. I joined an LGBT steering committee because nobody else in my particular program wanted to do it. For me, I saw it as a wonderful opportunity, but I was also struck by the fact that mine was the only hand that went up at the table. And so as a new social worker at that time, a lot of, some kind of worry and hesitancy about, why was it that nobody else was interested? What was the meaning of doing this work? Was there some type of history that I didn't know about? But I'm so glad that I put my hand up. And I do think that one of the things that has sustained me over time is that I have just I've gotten a lot bolder, and I found that as I raise my hand and speak up and talk about things and volunteer for more things, that I've noticed that people around me, I think, are start to put their hands up as well. That I think that there are more people who are interested in this, who care tremendously about it, who view its importance in the work, but that may be a little hesitant or tentative to be the first hand up. And so I think it's really important to, I've drawn a lot of strength from my allies in this work, from seeing new people come in and even reaching folks who've been working in my agency for a number of years, who maybe have had interest and seen the importance but not felt confident enough to step up, but do feel confident to join in my voice, to be a part of a larger movement. And so that's definitely something that's been sustaining for me.
I think, Antonia, you said it so beautifully that, I don't think I have much more to add, but on my experience, it's been similar. And to what you were saying, Al, I have felt, isolated, not marginalized necessarily, but you're right, you feel lonely when you're doing this work by yourself, and how important it is on the organization that you're working to have this support, to know that there are others that think like you and that they want to be supportive of LGBTQ youth, or, as Judy said earlier, of traumatized youth in general, because I think that was such a great analogy, because I see, what we do, it has a lot to do with social justice and, of being brave. When we're doing trauma-focused work, we're telling the child, it's okay for you to tell me what happened, and I'm going to be okay, and you're going to be okay, right? And with LGBTQ youth, it's very similar. It's, you can be open with me, and we're both going to be okay. And how we need for our colleagues, to be on board and to have, as Antonia said, to be able to speak up together as a team.
Yeah, I would just echo what Arturo has said that I draw my inspiration from the kids and the families I see. Much like other traumatized youth, these kids have been through stuff that I can't even imagine. And if they can go through this and come in here and do the work, I can support them in it. And they inspire me every day.
Are there any other key points that you as professionals would like to make as our participants are thinking about everything that we've reflected on today and what they've heard in the video, key points that would have been even more beneficial to you as either a young provider or a veteran provider, the things that you continue to learn as you do this work?
I think you just... Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think you just made a really important point, Jennifer, that this is not an event. This is a process. And we're all just continuing to learn. And, you know, to help all different kinds of people. And it continues to be a learning process for me, and I'm the oldest by far in this group, and I hope I continue to learn and grow to help all kinds of different kinds of people throughout this process. And, you know, there's still a lot more that I don't know than that I do, and these youth taught me so much just in this short process of and inspired me so much, and I just hope that we all continue to learn more. You don't have to be an expert to learn and grow and change, and I think that's a really important message here.
Great. And I think for me, as I look back to my own work and my own development, as well as being a trainer in this arena, a question that so often is asked of me, and this is specifically oftentimes how it's asked, is how do I get my client to come out to me? I know I have a gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender client. I can just see it in his eyes or her eyes, and I know they're struggling, and how do I get them to come out to me? And that's an area, too, where I've changed my perspective. And my goal is not to get my clients to come out to me. My goal is to create an environment so that if clients choose to come out to me, they feel safe and affirmed and are able to then grow from there. And it may feel like a nuanced difference, but it's a huge difference. I don't go in with that agenda. That's not mine to decide. I also can be wrong many times about the clients I perceive to be LGBTQ. I don't know who they are. I don't have that kind of ability to see through into somebody's heart and soul. So I'm often surprised by a client that may come out to me that just wasn't on my radar screen. Additionally, that process of coming out is incredibly important, that it be done to the extent that it can be, that it be done on the client's choosing when and where and to whom they come out. What I want to provide as a clinician is that space to say, if it's your time and you want to do it, I want you to know I'm a person you can do it with, but I don't go in with that agenda.
I would just add to all of these really wonderful points that I think are doing such a nice job of summarizing the facets of this work that, what I often remind myself of and share with others is what others have said, that you don't need to be an expert, and that if this is an area where you feel like you are, continuing to learn and grow and don't know everything and maybe feel hesitant, to not be afraid, to not lose sight of all of the wonderful skills that you already possess, because they are so applicable to this work. And that if you are really coming to your work with a place of good intent, where you are wanting to really meet your clients and your families where they are at and do best by them, and just be with them, that this is going to come through naturally. That it's very important to learn, to educate yourself, to become as familiar as you possibly can with all of the particular issues and concerns, but that if not to lose sight of all of the other skills that you already have, because they are certainly applicable.
And Judy mentioned inspiration earlier, and I'm really inspired about what my colleagues are saying. The only thing that I will add that I think comes naturally after what everyone said, it's the importance of supervision when we're working, with LGBTQ youth, traumatized LGBTQ youth, to have that, ongoing, hopefully weekly supervision. And so if you're not sure about what we're doing, and I agree with everybody that you don't need to be an expert, but you do have your supervisor who might be able, or will be able to answer most of your questions and really support you to support the child and youth that we work with.
And I want to also acknowledge specifically Judy Cohen and the work that she's done on this committee, because it has been a source of great information for me as well. As I think Antonio mentioned earlier around language, it's also true in other ways. We are continuing to learn and grow and change in our understanding about terminology and developmental process of sexual orientation and gender identity, and now about what happens when there is the overlay of trauma added to it. And the NCTSN, and in particular the Child Sexual Abuse Committee that Judy has so brilliantly sort of guided, has a host of resources that are available. This, talk about a change over the past 10 years, 15 years that I've been in this, doing this sort of work. We talked earlier about that sense of isolation. It's sort of hard to feel that so much now, because you can go to organizations like the NCTSN and actually see resources that are specific to this population, and that's a tremendous source of support and energy for me, and I really commend the work that committee has done to develop those resources, and encourage folks that may not be familiar with those to really take a look at what's out there. There's some really, really great stuff. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can make the wheel better, but we don't have to reinvent it. There's been some great work already done, and let's build upon the shoulders of some folks that have done tremendous work before us.
Thank you so much, Al. And